Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Oh, I like applause before the talk. Okay. Hi, my name is Mario. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks a lot to the organizers for inviting me. Yeah, so my talk will not be so much on a technical tutorial, but what I would like to give you is an idea of how advanced computational methods, including artificial intelligence, can actually contribute at a conceptual, creative level to science. And my talk will be split into 3 parts, where in the first one I will talk about more conceptual ideas. In the second one, I will talk about how AI can help in designing experiments and quantum experiments. And in the third one, I will talk about how we can use huge amount of scientific literature, millions of papers, to potentially get some ideas out. Each of the talks will be roughly maybe half an hour. Please feel free to interrupt me at any point. Okay, so let's think about the following setting. Imagine we have an oracle. And this oracle can predict the outcome of every high energy physics experiment, the outcome of every chemical reaction, and the function of every protein. So such an oracle would obviously be revolutionizing for science and technology. But as scientists, we would potentially not be entirely satisfied, because we want more than an oracle. We want actually to understand what the oracle, or how the oracle came up with its predictions. And this is a question we were thinking about for some years. We tried to approach the question of how we can actually get new scientific understanding with artificial intelligence. So we did this with 2 approaches. First, we sent out hundreds of emails to computational biologists, chemists, physicists, and machine learning researchers. And we got about how they got new ideas and concepts in their research using computers. And we got roughly 50 replies with very nice personal stories from those researchers. And second, we wanted to know what it actually means when we talk about scientific understanding. So what does it mean that we want to get? So maybe this is a good point to ask you, what do you think about when you talk about understanding, that you understood something or that you got some scientific understanding? Okay, a useful mental model. I repeat it for the chat.
Perhaps having an explanation that can explain the observed data, also that can pass the tests of critical thinking.
Of critical?
Thinking.
Okay. Any other ideas?
We should understand the cause and effects of like the causal effect. How does that happen?
Okay, so relation between cause and effects, okay.
A model that can do both, solve the forward problem and also the inverse problem when it comes to the phenomenon I'm studying.
Okay, okay, that's already a very difficult task.
Like explanation, which is a model with the smallest possible building blocks.
Okay, okay. Good. So we had a number of ideas now. So your idea was, can you repeat again? I wanted to say something about your idea. Right. The ability to predict something. If we have the ability to predict, this would be something like our oracle. So if we don't know the underlying reasons, some scientists might not be entirely happy with this if the reasoning is in black box. So the story of scientific understanding goes back actually to Heraclit. I found it the first time Heraclit said 2005 years ago. I forgot what he said. Anyway, does not teach reason. To know a lot does not teach reason. Okay, good. So, and that is now interpreted by philosophers as the first time where this came up. So, what happened in the last 100 years or 200 years, a lot of philosophers and scientists thought about it. For instance, for Boltzmann, he wanted to have a mechanical model. So when he had some explanation of some phenomena, he wanted a mechanical model. And if he can understand it with a mechanical model, he said, okay, this is what understanding is. For Schrödinger, he wanted a visual model, which kind of makes sense in the way if you think what Schrödinger has invented, this visual interpretation of quantum mechanics. So there are a lot of different interpretations. Some go in the direction of what you said, some are different. So one of the, when we approached this problem, what helped us a lot was a book that was just written a few years before we asked this question in 2017 by the philosopher Henk de Recht. And that book won the Lakatos Award, which is basically the biggest prize in philosophy. And de Recht came up with a pragmatic way to think about scientific understanding. So he said that scientists can understand the phenomena if they can recognize qualitative characteristic consequences without performing exact calculations. So scientific understanding is connected with the skill to use a concept fruitfully without exact calculations. And this interpretation was very helpful for us because it doesn't talk about the internal model, which a few of you have mentioned and many philosophers have also mentioned, but it basically only looks from outside and can judge from outside whether a human or in general some entity understood something. And with these two approaches, with the approach of philosophy of science and with the answers of the 50 working natural scientists, we came then up with a classification or characterization of how AI could contribute to scientific understanding. So the first class would be AI as a computational microscope, but basically you can think about, you can do computational experiments that you could not do in the physical world. So if you build extremely powerful simulators and represent your data in some interesting way, then this is where AI can and does contribute a lot, and this is where the human then can lift up this new way of seeing the data. The second part is AI as a source or even resource of inspiration, where you get some ideas or some insights that you would potentially not get without these programs. And the third one is AI as an agent of understanding, where basically the AI gets the understanding itself and transfers it to the human. So I will talk now about those three different classes briefly and give examples. So the first one is AI as a computational microscope. You can think about examples where you build extremely efficient simulators of large biochemical systems. For instance, there are very, very interesting work done on the COVID virus, where the structure of the COVID virus was understood much better by using advanced machine learning assisted simulations. So also an important part here is how do you represent the data for the human? And there are a lot of extensions one can think about. For instance, in the future, instead of using just CPUs or GPUs, we could think about using optical processing that can help to speed up the computation, or quantum computers to speed up the computation of much larger systems to show us how those systems look in a way that we have no access to in a physical microscope, for instance. A different way is to represent the data in a very different way, where the AI could try to find out how to represent the data in the best way for the human. And some interesting works there have been done in chemistry, where they use augmented reality to represent the space of molecules. And in this space, a human with 3D glasses can go around and see relations that you would potentially not see if you're just working at your screen. And in this space, the human can then walk around and also go to the individual places of the molecule and look at the molecules in 3D and see structure or observe structures or perceive structures that you would just at the 2-screen potentially not see. And I found this extremely interesting, so I bought a few Oculus glasses. So these are 2 of my students, Philipp Schmidt and Søren Alt, who are using 3D environments to try to understand some of the results of our AIs that create quantum experiments that I will mention later. And we have already seen that when you have a very beautiful 3D data representation, you can solve or you can see things and then understand things that you would very likely not see when you just look at 2D. So for us, this is already a huge tool that we are using. A different way to represent data is maybe not just by visual images, but we have more senses. For instance, we can hear. And there are some very interesting works, mainly in astronomy, where people are trying to use this additional sense and represent the data that you can hear. This process is called sonification of data. And in this review paper from last year, they have shown about 100 different projects, mainly astrophysical projects, where they translate the data from visual data into audio data, which is much easier for the human to perceive. And I would like to show you one example. Okay. Okay, so this is data, simulated data for gravitational waves. So a gravitational wave happens when you have 2 black holes that collide, and while they collide, just before they collide, they produce ripples in the space-time, and these ripples we can observe. I mean, probably not we, but people at the LIGO collaboration in the US and the Virgo collaboration in Italy. So they have observed about 100 gravitational waves until now. And the interesting thing is that the gravitational wave signal is extremely noisy. But they have shown when you translate this noise into audio data, or this signal with noise into audio data, we can actually perceive that something is there. And let me show you this example. So this is how gravitational wave would sound without noise. Okay. Let's do it one more time. Okay. So all of you are now gravitational wave data analysts. And the question is, in which of those 4 data streams do we have a gravitational wave? Huh? Who guesses? Yeah. Okay, it's very difficult to see. So it's basically completely impossible to see. But now, let's try to listen to it. And in one of those 4, we have the signal, okay? So listen to it carefully. Who thinks we had the gravitational wave here? Okay. Here? Interesting. Yeah. Do you see? Isn't that very impressive? That you can hear it from this crazy noise. So for me, it is kind of, how do I get this away? Okay. For me, it's quite clear that just from looking at these examples, if you could represent your data also in the audio spectrum, you could potentially gain a lot. So let me go back.
We have a few questions. Before I hand over the microphone, I just wanted to say that Tien, who's sitting here, he's doing something similar for seizure detection in infants. Is that right? Yeah, and
cool.
I've never heard about something like that before, so I was very surprised when I heard about it in a conversation
that's very cool.
the other day.
We should chat later.
But wouldn't you see it if it was in the frequency domain?
Yes.
There was another question, I think. Okay.
Yeah, that's true. But still, audio gives you basically a different dimension of perceiving data. And now the cool thing, what you could think about is that AI does not only represent the data as pictures or as numbers, but as 3D pictures or as 3D videos with sound, because that would use several of our senses at the same time, and it would probably help us to perceive actually the underlying structures and ideas, especially when the structures that we want to understand are very complex. It helps a lot to have these additional dimensions. The projects, most of the projects are in proof of principle stage, so they are not used yet, especially because here it's very easy, go to a frequency space. But people try to kind of use this additional dimension. Is there another question? Okay. Yeah, okay, and the coolest thing would be having an AI that finds something out that is very complex and then it produces a 3D video with sound. I would like to have that. Okay, so the second part is about AI as a source or resource of inspiration. And here we can think about the AI gives us some ideas that we would never think about, and we can then take this idea further and try to extract real understanding. And maybe I can briefly mention one of my own research. So my background is in experimental quantum optics, and there we are using. They are usually when you design experiments, they are designed by human experts. So the humans go either to the paper or to the drawing board, and come up with the solution of some experiments rather quickly. But at some point during my PhD, we wanted to investigate some very complex quantum correlated system, and that approach failed. So for several days and for weeks, me and my colleagues were not able to come up with a feasible experiment. And at that time I thought, how about we try to automate this whole process. And within a few hours, my program found exactly the solution that we were not able to find as human researchers. So, and that solution was then feasible, and my colleagues only needed 3 more years to actually build it in the lab and observe then these properties that we were interested in. But the cool thing is that it didn't only get very specific solutions, but it gave us ideas for new concepts. And let me very briefly mention this here, and I will probably mention it later again in slightly more detail. So after this algorithm was able to discover these first experiments that were built in the labs then, we were very happy and applied it to many other questions. And one of the questions that I applied it to was, I let it explore this space of quantum correlated experiments, which is enormously large. And I added a physical constraint to the algorithm, so it couldn't use it couldn't explore the full space. It couldn't use a lot of resources just because of computational resources, because then it gets more expensive to compute. So I knew that it cannot overcome some certain quantum correlation limits. And then I let the algorithm run for a few weeks on some unused computers. And when I came back, I actually found one file where it said that it significantly overcame this limitation that I thought needs to be there. So I thought there's a bug in my code, but then I looked at it, and the solution that the code gave was actually correct, and it actually can overcome this limit. So the question was then, how does the algorithm do it? Because as human, I cannot do this, and I thought there needs to be a limit. Then I looked into the solution for several days, and I saw that the algorithm used completely implicitly an idea from the early 90s that was basically forgotten until that time. And it applied this idea for this completely new question of quantum correlations. And that has never been done before in this way. And as soon as we understood this idea, we were immediately able to generalize it to many other systems. And we wrote a paper about this, and this purely computer-inspired idea that we explained in this paper just got its 100th citation a few weeks ago. So that was kind of cool. Okay, so one can see that computers can be used to detect outliers or anomalies, or can even generate them. But there are many other ways how one can use AI as a source of inspiration.
Can I ask a question, or should I ask? This sounds really interesting, how the computer got learned an algorithm on its own. Could you go into more detail, or will you go into more detail?
I will go into more detail in the second part. Is okay? Good. Okay, so one other way to use AI as a source of inspiration is by using a large amount of scientific literature. And there was an extremely interesting paper a few years ago about chemistry and material science. And there the researchers took more than 3 million scientific papers and used word-to-vec autoencoding. So word-to-vec is basically, they took an abstract and the tokens in this abstract, and they projected into a very high-dimensional continuous space. And when they did this, after the projection, they saw that the materials and their corresponding properties, they are very closely related in this high-dimensional abstract space. So then they looked more careful, and they looked, for instance, for the property of thermoelectricity. And they looked which materials are close to thermoelectricity. And they found, okay, the first few, all of them are actually known to be thermoelectric. So that's not so surprising, but what they found then down the line is some materials that were never mentioned ever in the scientific literature to have this property of thermoelectricity. So just from this big picture view of these 3 million papers, the machine was able to cluster this material close to thermoelectricity. And afterwards, they went into the lab, and this allowed them basically to go into the lab and investigate these new classes of materials for this certain property. And this is a big field that's called automated literature-based discovery. Super interesting to go into this. Okay, a different project, I will talk then in the third part, so I will skip this for now. A different way to get inspiration is by looking at interpretable output of neural networks. There's a lot of work being done, mainly in the field that's called symbolic regression, where the idea is that you find simple mathematical formulas that describe the behavior of your system. And this is often now applied together with neural networks. So basically, neural network learns some behavior, and then you try to extract mathematical formulas from this process. And here's one example where the authors do this on particle simulation. So basically, you have simple gravity and a few massive particles. They use neural networks to simulate this behavior, and then they try to extract mathematical formulas that describe the physics here. And they also applied this to some unknown dark matter behavior, also used the neural network to simulate it first, and then applied their symbolic regression to get some formulas out. And how this works. Yeah. So how this works is basically after the neural network, you apply something like a genetic algorithm where each of the genes is basically a formula, and there's crossover and there's mutations, and you favor then this formula that is most closely to your equation, but you penalize those that are too complex. For the dark matter data, so it's very interesting that they actually find some formulas. Unfortunately, the formulas are not very physical yet. They would, I think I looked into, and they have exponent of R of 27.4, so which would mean we live in a 27.4 dimensional spacetime. I'm not sure, maybe string theory is, I'm not the expert in this. Okay, a different way to get inspiration is, instead of looking into the neural network, instead of looking at the results of the neural network, you can actually look into the neural network and see what the neural network has learned. And there's another quite interesting work about this. And here the authors take positional data of objects in our solar system, namely of the Sun and of Mars, and they asked for the dynamics of those planets as they are seen from Earth. So input data is time-dependent positional data of the Sun and of Mars. And of course, you can train a neural network to do this. This is not very surprising, but the surprising thing is then the authors looked into the neural network and they have seen that internally, instead of describing the data in terms of this geocentric view, as the coordinates seen from Earth, it made a coordinate transformation, and it uses the data in the form of as it was seen from the Sun. So it basically made the transformation from the geocentric to the heliocentric worldview. And that is kind of cool, because that was a kind of big thing 400 years ago. But this shows that you can use neural networks, when you look into it, you can actually extract and see which coordinate transformations it is using to predict this data in a careful way, or which symmetry it uses. And if this is now applied to more modern questions, you could get surprised by finding new ways of thinking about which transformation you should apply on your data, and then think about what the transformation might mean. What's the time? Okay. Then maybe let me also skip this. The other quite interesting idea is to, instead of using the internal modes or the output of the neural network, actually observing the behavior of the machine itself. And that is related to the idea of curiosity-based exploration. There was a very interesting paper a few years ago, I think 2017, they applied this to the game of Super Mario, and later with OpenAI they applied it to a lot of Atari games. There, they made an agent that solves the game of Super Mario. So when we know the results of DeepMind, this is also not particularly impressive, but what they did is they did it in a different way. So usually when you want to solve such a game, you give the agent the score of the game, and with the score it knows whether it performed well or not so well. But in this case, they didn't give any external score from the game. Instead, the agent makes action into direction of the world that it doesn't understand very well. So it goes into direction where his prediction about the world has problems. And just with this very simple idea, the Super Mario agent was able to solve the game of Super Mario. And you can imagine why that works. So let's say you're at the start of the game and you run, and then a mushroom comes and you run into the mushroom, you die, you go to the beginning of the world. So you already know the beginning of the world, so that's very boring for you. So next time you try to avoid the mushroom. So you jump over and so on. And just with this, they show that they can finish this game. But now the cool thing is, you can think about this in a space of, I don't know, let's say the space of interesting chemical materials or molecules. For instance, some molecules that are good for solar cells. The machine could explore this space, and you could observe how the machine is exploring your space. And when you see that the machine gets stuck at some point, you probably know that at this place the machine has a problem in learning its behavior. So probably at those spaces the machine will learn some new physics or chemistry knowledge. And now you as an observer, just from outside, could look at those places. You see where the machine got stuck. And you can just look into, and with a little bit of luck, there's a new physical phenomena. So this is highly speculative, just a guess that it works. So if you try it and it doesn't work, please don't blame me. Okay, we tried such a technique actually in the world of chemistry. We see that it can improve the exploration speed, but we didn't go to the step of where we can observe the space, the algorithm. Okay, and now let's go briefly to the last class, the agent of understanding. So here, in this last class, the agent would learn somehow autonomously some new understanding. And because we are humans and we want to get the understanding, it needs to transfer to us. But how can we say that the machine has gotten understanding? With our definition from before, it requires that it does not perform exact calculations. But when we talk about machines, how can we talk about this? So basically, this is very difficult to apply. But something that is much easier to apply is when we require that the machine, where we cannot judge because of this condition, where we cannot judge whether it got understanding, that it translates its understanding to a human, and then we can test the human. So basically, if the machine can teach the human in an efficient way, we can then test the human, and with that we can, if we want, make conclusions about the machine. So basically, we could now build up something like an adapted Turing test, where you have a teacher, which could be a computer or a human. You have a student, and the teacher translates its understanding to the human. And afterwards, a referee has to guess whether which of the two is the student. So if the teacher can explain this phenomena completely, the referee will not be able to judge between those two. And then we can say, okay, if it was actually the computer transferred its understanding to the student, and by that it kind of needed to have something like understanding itself. Okay, and with this, just a small last sentence. It's clear kind of that computers can be used in science in a much more creative way than we might think, where they can actually help at a conceptual level, not just as a super efficient and useful computational tool, but actually at the conceptual level. And this is now being explored in several different fields in science. Okay, thank you. So if there are questions now, we could take those questions, and otherwise we can continue with the second part.
Maybe one question?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Where are you?
Yes.
Ah, okay, sorry.
So, especially like on the last example, which was the most exciting and you skipped it most quickly, the agent is, so there is no differentiating between new kind of understanding or knowledge or transferring the existing, right? A huge difference. And then all of it, or this direction of creating or especially the new knowledge, goes into the symbolic AI direction. So basically your connection here to the symbolic AI, because it seems without it, everything we do is so, in machine learning now, is all in this continuous space of probabilities without exactly those simplified discrete models which we humans use for logic and knowledge.
Okay, so the first part about the new, yes, this is very, very important. In our paper, we always write new understanding. We clarify it very much, and I forgot it now, which thank you for saying that. Yes, the very important part, so we actually want to use this in science. It means, of course, we want to have it finding new knowledge. And that is very important because I think that rediscovery tasks, which are often used as benchmarks, so if the tool can rediscover some physical formulas and so on, it's not clear whether, when you apply those rediscovery tasks, whether you don't implicitly introduce some bias. So that because you know the solution, maybe you search for that exact solution. For instance, when they found that the tool made the transformation from geocentric to the heliocentric worldview, I wonder whether that is so easy to find it if we don't know that we should look for exactly that transformation. So the new understanding, new knowledge, that is very, very crucial. The second part, symbolic, it's not necessary that this is about symbolic AI. For instance, I think I have some mental pictures of physical phenomena that live completely without mathematics. It's just visual pictures. And maybe I could write it down as mathematics, but how I think about them are completely unmathematical. And actually, my PhD supervisor, when we were talking, we were kind of, when we wrote down formulas, we were kind of not allowed to explain it just in formulas, but also via intuition. And with some different intuitive models. So I think it's not necessary to always go to symbolic methods. For instance, if the AI could create a very cool 3D movie, and you see then why it happens, has nothing to do with math or with symbols. But symbols could be one solution, but it's not the only that I could imagine. Mm-hmm.
Yep. I have a question to the interpretation of the Latin space where they learned like new coordinate systems. What was the task initially that they looked at? Was it learning new representation, or was it like a side effect that they discovered on the problem they're looking at?
You mean for the word-to-vec?
Yeah, exactly. For the
as far as I remember, it was just a simple standard autoencoding question, and they used this autoencoding and saw that the machine encoded it in a very specific way. So it was completely unsupervised. So there was no incentive that it should do that. But word2vec is encoding concepts. That is known. It's encoding concepts that are close anyway, closely together. And they exploited this property in chemistry with this very clever idea to search for this material, how's it called, structure property relation. Does this answer the question?
No, I think it's with the physics case, with the stars on Earth, where they have like a different coordinate system.
Okay. Where they predict the position of Mars and the Sun, you mean?
Yeah, I think yes. Was
okay. There the task was they gave data of the Sun and of Mars, and they basically wanted a model that can predict the dynamics of it. So they wanted a model that can predict the position of the Sun and of Mars. So basically, because it's a very simple system, these are two angles, and they wanted to predict those two angles over time. And so they gave a lot of training data, exactly this type of training data, and then, so that is not the very impressive part, but then the kind of impressive part was that they were able to manipulate the neural network in such a way that they are able to look into. And you cannot do this with a normal neural network because it has, at each layer, it has hundreds of parameters. They introduced information bottleneck. That means there was one layer that I think had only 5 neurons or so. And with the 5 neurons is small enough that you can actually check what is going on. And you can make a lot of plots. And this is what they have done. They looked at this. I think they also did something like better variational autoencoder, which kind of forces the neural network to encode in different different concepts. But I'm not completely sure whether this was the important part. I think they used it, but it's likely that this was not really the important part. The information bottleneck, that was the crucial thing.
Yeah, thanks.
Actually, if I may jump in.
Sure.
So this is actually not exactly a question, but on a similar note of the latent representations. I know of this interesting line of work where there are some theoretical results that prove that certain representation learning algorithms, like the contrastive learning, provably learns the true generative factors of the system under certain assumptions and like up to some symmetries. And I find that really fascinating.
Yeah, so improvement in this space is definitely very important. The question is whether you can take this improvement and ideas and apply it to physics problems, because it's often difficult to see how you can apply it and how big the advance is. As I just mentioned in this other example with Earth and Sun and Mars, they used a better variational autoencoder, but as far as I remember, other people have then shown that similar things work completely without this beta variational autoencoder, just with these bottlenecks. And I think there were other papers about other physical problems, in thermodynamics, where they have done similar things without this technique, which is very useful in computer vision and generative pictures. So it's always the tricky part to translate it to physical questions.
This is not actually a question, but you mentioned this interesting source, Philosophy of Science, Pragmatic Theory of Scientific Understanding. I think I write it down not properly because I cannot find it now in Google.
The author is called Henk de Rek, and the book is very simple, Understanding Scientific Understanding. Very cool title, actually. Should be here. Where's the name is here direct. Also, actually, if you're interested in this, I would recommend to read this article first. This is basically 15-page or 20-page summary of the book where the main ideas are already in. In the book, he presents the whole history, which is really fascinating, but and many use cases. But if you're interested, as a start, I would recommend to start with this 2005 paper.
So it looks like it's pretty common for some technique to be really effective in a moment and then be forgotten for years. And then maybe somebody rediscovers it and uses it for some new unsolved problem. So I was wondering, given a new problem, is there any way to search maybe at a higher level of abstraction for anything, maybe from a faraway niche or field that may be of help to solve it?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and there's a very interesting field of research that's called literature-based discovery. There's a lot of NLP work, basically exactly on this. They try to find good representation and then see connections that should be there, but are not there, or they could be there. I will go into this in my third talk, not exactly on this, but something related. Let me write down one name if you're interested in Tom Hope. I think he's Allen Institute and AI and Hebrew or something. He has some very cool papers recently. So I mentioned him because I just met him a few days ago, so he's in my mind. There are probably many others, but you can definitely find in his papers the references. So it's a very interesting work. It is actually known since the 70s that such literature-based discovery could work. Namely, there were some researchers in Chicago who actually went through scientific paper manually and tried to find links, try to write down some knowledge network, try to find links. And he actually found that you can cure, I forgot, you can take from very crazy, you can use some medicine from somewhere completely different that you would never expect. He just saw it because of this knowledge graph that he wrote down by hand. So that's very interesting, very promising. Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, should we go to the next part? Oops. Yeah. Okay. So the next part is about using advanced computational methods and AI for the design of new quantum experiments. That's actually close to my heart because this is what the main part of my group is working on. So let's start with a motivation, why one wants to do that. So let's consider the space of all possible experiments or quantum experiments. So these are this is an extremely large space. If you look at the numbers, if you just have, for instance, 3 lasers, 3 beam splitters, and 3 detectors, you can already create 1,000 different topological configurations. If you have 5 of them, you can create more than 80,000 combinations. And in this space, you have all experiments, including all of the experiments that have some interesting and useful properties. For instance, let's think about gravitational wave detectors. This could all be some fancy gravitational wave detectors that exist. Now, this space is explored usually by human researchers. And human researchers are very creative. They explore the space and they find cool new experiments for instance, gravitational wave detectors, for instance. This could be a Michelson interferometer. This could be the original experiment from LIGO. This could be advanced LIGO. This could be ancient telescope, and so on. But in this space, many possibilities, especially those that are potentially quite unorthodox, might never be discovered by humans. And this is where computational approaches can help. So a computer can search through the space basically without intuition. It's not halted. It's also much faster. And so computer-designed experiments make a lot of sense when you think about this large space. And I would like to start, I think, yes. So my background, I think I mentioned it, is experimental quantum optics. And this whole story for me started with experimental quantum optics. So I would like to introduce you now to some quantum optics and entanglement. Who knows what quantum entanglement is? Oh, okay. Good. Someone wants to explain it, or should? Okay. For those who don't know what entanglement is, imagine you have 2 particles, okay? And let's say those are light particles. And those light particles, they can have different properties. For instance, they can have a color, because, of course, light particles are made up of color, which is basically the frequency of the light particle. And now, those 2 light particles can be far apart. Of course, you can shoot them far apart. But quantum entanglement is something very interesting there. You can have those light particles, for instance, both having the color red or both having the color green. And before you measure them, you can not know whether they are red or green. And just at the moment when you measure them, you will find out whether, when you measure the first particle and you see it is red, you know also its partner particle is red. But before you measure them, you cannot say whether it is green or red. And this is basically the topic from last year's Physics Nobel Prize. So this is investigated, I think, since the 70s or so, and experiments have been done since the 70s about this property. But during my PhD, we wanted to investigate more complex quantum entangled systems. So you can make quantum entangled systems more complex in basically 2 different ways. So one way is that instead of 2 particles, you can now use 3 particles. For instance, like here, we have now 3 particles where all of them are either red or all of them are green. And again, before you measure them, they don't have a well-defined color. Only when you measure the first one and see, okay, it is red, also the partner particles become red. And the strange thing is those partner particles could be far away, but still, when you measure them, they collapse into color red. And multi-particle entanglement, like here, is the main resource for modern quantum computers. So for quantum computers, you need huge amount of entangled particles. A second way to make entanglement more complex is by using more colors. For instance, in this case, we have two particles, and both particles are either red or green or blue. And again, before you measure them, they don't have a well-defined color. Only when you measure them, you have a well-defined color. And this is very interesting for communication or quantum communication tasks, because now suddenly you can transmit more than 1 bit of information per photon. Because here, imagine you have 4 colors, you can encode 2 bits of information per photon. So this used a lot for quantum communication, and both of those systems have been observed for the first time in the late 1990s, so also a long time ago. And what we wanted to do is take basically the next step, combining many particles with many colors. Because even theoretically, there are a lot of questions about such systems, and no one has ever created it at that point, which was, let's say, 2000, well, a long time ago, 2014. Okay. So we wanted to create this type of state in the laboratory. So the first thing that we need to do is find the experimental setup. And as I mentioned before, usually this is done by humans, but we tried for weeks and we were not able to come up with any experimental setup that we can build in the lab. So as teased before, I thought about how to automate that process. And I wrote a very simple algorithm to start to solve this problem. So in this algorithm, we start with a toolbox of all possible experimental components that we have in the lab. For instance, beam splitter, lasers, phase shifter, and so on. Then in the beginning, we combine those elements in a random way, and then basically compute what is the output. And usually in the beginning, the output will be not what we are interested in. So we do it again with a different random configuration. But if the experiment is in some way interesting, we simplify it and report it to the user. And also we take the simplified form and add it to the toolbox. And in that way, the algorithm learns over time what are potentially interesting macro components. So it can use in the next steps already these macro components to start from a much more elaborate initial guess. And over time it builds up the knowledge of this experimental space. And I wrote this algorithm, very simple, and within a few hours it actually produced exactly the solution that we were interested in. And my colleagues were able to build it then in the lab. And this is actually a picture in the lab. So the result from my algorithm was, I think, 8 components or so. But then when you have to build it in the lab, it gets much more complicated. So basically the principle is there's 8 components, but you need to add a lot of different things. Therefore, usually those optical tables look very crazy. So we were very happy, and we applied it to many other questions that we were not able to solve. For instance, we found new ways how to control and manipulate photonic systems. And just last year or 2 years ago, we applied this very similar idea also to superconducting quantum computers. So there, usually people work with qubits, so with zeros and ones, with 2-level systems. But IBM had the ability to go to the 3rd level. And we asked them, and we got a special pulse level access to their machine. And we tried to create, again, this multi-particle, high-dimensional, entangled state. And again, we were not able to come up with any quantum circuit that could generate this state. And then I went back to my files to 2017 and found this algorithm again and applied it, and basically exactly the same algorithm found within minutes. The quantum circuit that would generate the state that we were interested in, and we were then actually able to create it at one of those IBM machines.
Sorry, we have a question.
If you could please go back one or two slides to the pipeline of the algorithm. Yeah, how do you measure the feasibility of the solution, or the, I don't know.
But that's interesting.
Okay. Yeah, whether it's interesting or not.
Yeah. So you have to do this case by case. In this case, we wanted to find a complex entangled system. So I said everything is interesting that is non-trivially entangled. And non-trivial entangled is everything that is more than two-particle, two-dimensional entanglement. So every time when it found something that is more complex entanglement than the trivial one, it simplified and sorted to the toolbox. And then for later generation, it was able to build up upon what it found there. So we basically broke down the question of this three-dimensional particle entangled system into many, many small sub-questions.
So you're both taking into account what the experimental setup is generating as a like from the physical perspective, and the actual feasibility of the building blocks themselves.
In the toolbox, we only had building blocks that we knew were feasible, so we automatically solved this problem. It reduced the search space, but we only put in stuff that my colleagues were able to use.
So it's only
yeah,
putting modules one on top of
exactly.
the other. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so is this basically like an evolutionary algorithm, where you kind of have some basic creatures in the toolbox, and then if it solves one of the criteria, you add another one, and you always just randomly kind of mix them?
Yeah, so we thought about it, how to describe this in terms of normal AI terms. It's not really evolutionary because there's no swarm. It's a rudimentary form of maybe reinforcement learning, because it reinforces those elements that it already saw. Basically, in a very crude way, it stores them and can use them later again. So maybe that is the best way to think about it. But it was very, very pragmatic on our problem. And the strange thing was that it worked immediately, so I didn't need to think to do anything more clever. So that was very good. Yeah. Therefore, we didn't, at that point, need to do any very fancy machine learning techniques or exploration techniques, because it was basically the first time that that people have applied automated discovery of experiments in this field. So there were a lot of low-hanging fruits around. So that was kind of, yeah.
Okay. Also, one thing which still confuses me here is you have criteria, and like naively I would say, okay, if it fulfills the criteria, it solves the experiment, so you're done. But you kind of showing, okay, it fulfills the expensive criteria, but then I'm not really done, but I already can add this to the toolkit, toolbox.
This is basically these are necessary criteria that are cheap to compute, such that I don't need to run the full quantum simulation, because the full quantum simulation takes quite some time, and I can already see from the construction when I can reject some setups. For instance, when one particle never interacts with any others, it will not be involved in entanglement, and when I want to have complete entanglement, I can just reject it. So it's basically just to speed up the computation. I can remove this if I have more time.
Okay, no, I was just wondering, like, if you have the solution, why aren't you done, but and instead put it to the toolbox again?
Yes. So our solution. So we broke down our solution into many sub-solutions, because, of course, otherwise it would be just a complete random search. But we didn't want that. We wanted that it builds up slowly its knowledge, because then it's faster. One can see it's for even small systems roughly 10 times faster. So we broke down this complicated question into many smaller questions. And even if those smaller questions are solved, I store it. So even if something that is slightly non-trivial but not the solution yet, I already store it and can already reuse it.
Okay, thank you.
So how would this compare to here? So how would this compare to something like Bayesian optimal experiment design, where you would want to essentially maximize the expected information gain at every step through some quantum Fisher information or something? Because this is more random, and that would be more Bayesian.
Yes. There are a lot of more fancy ways that you can do. Bayesian optimization might be one. I don't know how good Bayesian optimization would work here, because it's a very discrete search space where when you change one element, it's basically completely different. So that also makes it very difficult to apply clever machine learning techniques. And I will show later what we do instead of this. But it could be used for slightly different problems. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to ask, I might have missed this, you might have commented on this, but is this sort of a similar sort of approach or problem as program induction type of thing? Program synthesis?
In a way, probably yes. Yeah, for programs, you also have a very discrete search space where one change changes everything. This was just in the recent DeepMind paper. They said how difficult it is. They used, I don't know, 50 highly intelligent people, and I don't know how many TPUs. I used me and my laptop. Yeah, so because this was some years ago, it was an easy start. I didn't need to go into this. But yeah, at some point it is very related. I guess you could use similar algorithms. Okay, then let me continue. So, right, so we found now some experimental setups, we found some quantum circuits, we were very happy about this. But for me, the most interesting thing was that we actually can learn those concepts from the machine. I think I already mentioned this. We found that the machine found basically some outlier that I thought is completely impossible that it generates. And I was very nervous because I thought, okay, the program has a bug and I wasted weeks of computation and I need to restart everything again. But the solution actually worked, and when I found it out, we were immediately able to generalize it to many other systems. Basically, we have now a quite systematic way to generate a photonic quantum entanglement. So basically, the question from before, we don't need computer algorithms anymore because we know now how to do it by hand. So we can now go back to our drawing boards and do our papers again. We don't need computers for those type of questions anymore. And so we were very happy about those algorithms, about this this new way to think about quantum entanglement. And actually we found also that this new type of quantum entanglement, of generation of quantum entanglement, this computer-inspired ideas, is directly related to graph theory. And we found this after the paper was published, and there was a new student, and I asked the student she should look into it, and she found there's a mistake in the paper. So she found that one of the statements we made in the papers is not correct. So we misunderstood this idea that the computer proposed to us. The main part of the paper was correct, it was very good, but we had to write a small erratum. about this part, but this part pointed us to the real description of this computer-inspired idea. And this real description is a pure graph theoretical description. So we can now think about all of those type of quantum experiments, which are very messy in the lab. We can completely abstract everything away and think about it as colored and weighted graphs. And they contain now all the information of those original quantum experiments. So, which is kind of cool, this first computer-inspired idea paper that was cited 100 times now. When we published it, we didn't understand the idea well enough, what the computer tried to propose to us. Yeah. And actually, one of the reviewers told us, hey, this looks very good, but you should try to understand this, really what is underlying before the, yeah. Okay, anyway, we were very happy, and now very recently there were several experiments, all of them actually this year, that used exactly this new type of graph representation that directly came through the idea of the computer. For instance, this paper that is called Very Large-Scale Integrated Quantum Graph Photonics is so far the largest integrated photonic experiment. And it shifted away from this old type, how to do integrated optics, and they try out this new type of graph-based integrated optics. Also, these two papers, they looked at some of the predictions from this graph theory. So I got sometimes the question whether we put the computer algorithm that actually did all the creative work, to be honest, whether we put it as a co-author. We did not put the computer algorithm as a co-author, but we put it into the acknowledgement and said, thank you for analyzing 100 millions of setups. But then a few years later, my PhD supervisor and I, we got invited to write a contribution to a perspective paper about big questions in physics. And we wrote a small part about how can a computer algorithm find autonomously new, surprising, or creative insights. And we were able to smuggle the name of the computer algorithm into the author list. So basically, AI Melvin. Melvin was the name of my algorithm. It's now co-author of a published and peer-reviewed paper. So that was very cool. But what was even more surprising, that after the paper was published, two of the co-authors became Nobel Prize winners. So John Goodenough, who unfortunately just died recently, got the Chemistry Nobel Prize, and my PhD supervisor last year the Physics Nobel Prize. So now we have a computer algorithm that shares as a co-author a paper with two Nobel Prize winners. Yeah. Okay.
How do you even decide the order of the author with the computer?
How do what?
How do you decide about the order of the author when you have like competitive computer?
Here?
Yeah.
I forgot how this was done. Was it alphabetically? I think it's alphabetically, and Susie Lidström was the main person who motivated all of the people to write, which is very difficult because all of those people are mainly old, more established professors, and they have no time, so it was very hard work for her to get everyone motivated. Yeah, and she was involved in this, so she knew. So yeah. Okay. What's the time? Should we go for?
We have 5 minutes left.
Yeah, so I think now it's a good time to stop, because then I can talk about the last part.
All right, then let's take a coffee break now. Can I ask you for a round of applause?
Thank you. So yes, middle of the second part. So what I showed before was an algorithm that was kind of simple. It just uses or reuses the experimental configuration that it has already seen before. So the problem is, if you go to more complex or have more complex questions, it is still an incredibly large discrete search space, and discrete search spaces are usually very difficult to explore. So at some point we had some questions that we wanted to answer, new for new fancy quantum states that we wanted to generate that have some interesting physical properties. And with my old method, we were not able to do it anymore. So we had to come up with a new method. And this is basically still the idea that we are using right now. That is so far the best computational method to discover experiments in this domain. So the idea is to use this abstract representation of experiments in the form of graphs. So I mentioned this before. This graph-based representation was actually the underlying representation that that came from this computer-inspired idea. And now we use actually exactly this representation for a new type of algorithm. So what we are doing now is we translate this messy, discrete experimental setup into a graph. And that graph contains the complete information about the experiment. So this graph is, has colored edges, and its edges have weights. So it's now continuous, a continuous object. And we know also how to translate this graph back to an experiment. So we know how to go from the experiment to the graph and from graph to experiment. And what is cool about this representation is that it not only carries the information about the quantum experiment, but in the same way it carries the information about the quantum state itself. That means about the output of the experiment. So now we can, if we have no experimental question, we can translate this question into graph theory. We can solve the question there with graphs, and we translate the answer back to those discrete setups. And this is basically the state of the art that we are using at the moment. So a very good feature of those graphs is when you look at the complete graph and you have it parametrized, okay, this is the complete graph with 4 vertices. Right, a vertex basically stands for a photonic path, so a position of a photon. The edge stands for a photon pair, so basically a 2-photon correlation. The edge weights are the amplitudes, so the strength of this correlation, and the color stands for the mode. So basically the color of the photons that we had in the very beginning. It's also now the color of these edges. So now when you have an experiment with 4 photon paths, you know from this representation that everything that you can do in the lab, everything independent of how many optical elements you put, you can describe it with a complete graph. There's nothing that you can do more in this in this domain of quantum optics. Everything you can describe with such a graph. That means instead of having a very discrete and potentially infinitely large space, we now have a continuous finite space. So that makes the problem much, much easier. Recently I'm thinking about this as a kind of universal approximator of experiments. And in a kind of similar way as a neural network would be a universal approximator of functions, we have now a universal approximator of those experiments. So those inspiration from neural networks come in somewhat. Now I mentioned that these graphs represent now the output of the experiments. And when those outputs are now parametrized with the weights from the graph, with those strength of the correlation, that means we can write now a state in terms of the weights of this graph. And from the state we can compute all sorts of different properties that we're interested in. For instance, fidelity, or how good it works for some applications, for instance, quantum metrology, so how good it is for quantum enhanced measurements and so on. And all of that is now a continuous function in terms of the weights of this graph. So what we can, so this is the formula that relates the graph with the quantum state, not so important, just to show that it's continuous. But what is important now, because we have a continuous space and we can write the objective in a continuous function, we can now use gradient-based optimization. So similar as you would train a neural network, just we don't do it with training example because we know we want to find a certain target. So we basically use now gradient-based optimization in this new type of representation. And another interesting thing is that after we find a solution that satisfies or that maximizes our objective, after we do this, we can try to remove the edges that are not used or that are not useful and rerun the optimization. So basically, we try to find the solution in the most complete graph. We throw away a bunch of edges and we re-optimize it. So we basically go back to the minimum. And in the end, we usually stick with a graph that cannot be further optimized anymore. And that graph usually is very small and very simple. And basically, when we solve questions now, we start from here, we get this as the output, we look at the output, and in many cases we can immediately understand why that solution works. So I have some example, but I think I will skip those examples. Just the ideas that we can look at those solutions that we get from this algorithm, and we can understand why it works, because we understand what the physics of this new representation means. And when we understand this physics, we can, of course, again, apply these ideas elsewhere without computation. So in some way, again, this shows how we can get understanding. But in this case, instead of looking for a week at the setup and try to extract the conceptual core, here the computer automatically extracts the conceptual core for us because this new representation allows for that. Yeah, and recently we expanded this space, this representation. We can now apply this representation. That's the core reason why this optimizer, why this discovery tool works so well. We apply it to many different questions. For instance, how can you do certain quantum gates? How can you do some certain quantum measurements? How can you do some quantum communication tasks? All of those tasks that we were not able to answer before, we now basically apply our algorithm and get basically immediately, that means within a few minutes, maybe sometimes a few hours, we get solutions that we can understand. Maybe I show one example. So who knows what entanglement swapping is? Oh, but there were many people who knew about quantum physics. How can you not know entanglement swapping? No, I'm just joking. Okay, so entanglement swapping is a quantum communication protocol that shows you how you can entangle particles that have never interacted with each other. And it was one of the reasons why Zeilinger got the Nobel Prize last year, because this is now a very important concept in the foundations of quantum information. So the idea is, so you want to entangle two particles that never interacted with each other. What you can do is you have an entanglement here and the entanglement here, and you measure those two particles in the middle. You project them into an entangled state. And when you do this, you will find that the output particles, because you project them into an entangled state, the output particles also needs to be entangled. And so you can see you need to measure two particles in order to create entanglement between two other particles. You can think now, what if I want to have two entangled pairs? So you would probably measure 4 particles here. What if I want to create 3 entangled pairs? You probably need to measure 6 particles here. And that sounds like a very reasonable limit that comes from information theory. We applied exactly this question to our algorithm. And what it found is that when you create 3 pairs of entangled particles, you only need to measure 4 particles here. So when my students came and showed me this, I said, okay, this is 100% wrong. Please go back and check it. And then he came back and said again, that's true. And then we tried to analyze this and see what is going on. How can there be a system that seems to overcome a limitation that just comes from the foundations of quantum information? And we're still not completely ready to understand it. We are now completely ready with understanding that it probably works. And the 3D goggles that I showed you before, we use it exactly to try to disentangle graphs like these. So we are trying to use now those 3D spaces, this virtual reality, to understand some of the solutions, some of the very, very weird solutions from our algorithms.
There's
Okay.
a question here.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, could you go over again why the setup on the right doesn't comply with the theory explained?
Yes. Here, for each entangled photon pair here and here, okay, outside, you need to measure 1 entangled photon pair in the middle. If you think that you create now 3 of those, you would guess you need to measure 3 entangled pairs in the middle. But our algorithm found a solution that needs less resources, less than we thought should be a foundational limit of quantum information. So, yeah. Yeah, we were very surprised, and in the context of what I mentioned before, this is a clear example how a computer can be an inspiration for new ideas or for looking into new directions, because obviously I would have never asked my student or try to analyze myself whether it's possible to create something like this, because I thought there's a limit, it cannot be created. But the computer showed us, hey, should be possible. And now we can look at it. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. I have a question about something I think you mentioned a little bit earlier. You said, I think, or maybe I misunderstood, that the graph representation that you find for these experiments, it already tells you something about the outcome of the experiment. And I'm struggling a bit to understand, like, what is the relation of this predicted outcome from the graph with the actual outcome of the experiment? Yeah, maybe, I don't know if the question makes sense, but maybe you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Yes, the question makes sense. For that, you need to know what this graph representation is and what normal experiments are doing. So normally, in the lab, what you do is you create photon pair correlations. From that, you basically build up all of your quantum states in this domain of quantum optics. So, for instance, when you have certain optical elements, for instance, a beam splitter, which is a half-silvered mirror, where in 50% the light goes through and 50% reflected, it modifies some of the correlation that you created in the beginning. But now in this graph-based picture, everything, every edge and everything are the representation, are the correlations themselves. So what is very complicated, described in an experimental setup, in this discrete experimental setup, is now in a very simple way described in these graphs, because we don't care about those beam splitters anymore. Everything we have are correlations. And from this correlation, you basically get exactly the same state, because you can see how each optical element acts in this space. And therefore we know that when we apply then a similar mathematics or similar formulas, that we get the similar quantum state out. I could go into it a little bit more, but I think that needs to become slightly technical then. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, why do you need virtual reality to explore this graph? Because I imagine it would be fairly easy to do some kind of visualization on a computer, also maybe in 3D space or something. So how do you actually improve on that with virtual reality?
Yeah, so we don't use virtual reality, we use 3D, 3D environment. And we are projecting this graph into the 3D world, and we apply some sorting algorithms, and then it becomes very clear that there are some specific structures in there, which you see when you stand in the 3D world, you turn around, okay, you see imagine you see a cube or something. It's very obvious in 3D, maybe not so obvious here, or a hypercube. It's even better. You can basically not see a hypercube in 2D, but it's much easier to see it in 3D. And we see those structures, and Philip, the master student who mainly works on this, saw then quite quickly structures appearing. Also when we went and do more complex states for generalizations, he saw those structures, and now he can create those structures himself.
Just a follow-up question. I was wondering, why are you going in the direction of having a 3D? Because you're basically limited by 3 dimensions with our own site, instead of trying to figure out how to compress it down in some way where you could present it even in lower dimensions, especially when the graphs might get more complex. I think 3D might not be enough anymore.
So one difference between 2D and 3D is that in 2D, you might have crossings of edges, which are very difficult to understand. So for all non-planar graphs, where you cannot draw it without crossing, it's kind of intricate. For instance, that is, I forgot, but it looks like a non-planar graph. But when you have it in 3D, you can just have the one edge before, the other edge after, below, and it is easier to see. Of course, if we would have some idea to go to 2D, that would even be better, because then we can use the third dimension for something else if we need them. So if you have some ideas, please let me know. Okay, let me come to very briefly to something else. So for those quantum experiments, the state-of-the-art design method seems to be this graph-based representation, where you change the idea of a discrete, infinitely large search into a continuous, finite, gradient-based optimization. But we also try to apply some neural networks for other questions. For instance, we wanted to see how a neural network is representing the idea of quantum experiments itself. So that was very much inspired by this autoencoder idea that I mentioned before, where you have the positions of the Sun and Mars, and you can look into the latent space. We wanted to do something similar here, and wanted to understand how the neural networks can represent quantum experiments internally. And so we also introduced information bottlenecks. We also introduced information bottlenecks such that we can look now at the different neurons. And when you project it into 2 neurons in the center, you can actually plot the output of the neural network just at the 2D sheet, and that's what we are doing here. So we try to understand how are those neural networks representing quantum physics, in this case, in 2D. So we put in some quantum experiments. And this is a variational autoencoder, so we want to reconstruct the experiment in the end. And then later in the middle, we look what is the output of the neurons internally. And then we see that completely in an unsupervised way, it clusters together experiments that are entangled and experiments that are not entangled. And we found out that this is because there are some structural reasons that we were not completely aware of. It was obvious afterwards. There are some structures that allows you to predict whether an experiment produces entanglement, yes or no. And the neural network classifies the experiments basically exactly in this way. Or it doesn't do it explicitly, it just happens to do it that when we look at it, we see this structure. And that could also be, if we go further, the more complex question be used for inspiration, that we see again such structures that the neural network completely implicitly does. And how you try to understand the internal structure is by looking at it manually. So I looked at, I don't know, hundreds of different latent spaces and different plots in the latent spaces and try to understand what is actually going on. So this was a very tedious work. And you don't see it, you just see nice plots. Anyway, I wanted to show it because it was so time consuming. Okay, with this, at the end of the second part. So now we have algorithms that can design quantum experiments basically for open questions, and we have a way to learn and understand new ideas from there.
So once you take a look at the latent space, what are the takeaways? It's like just an understanding of the structure of one particular experiment, or
yeah. So maybe the main takeaway is that even an entirely unsupervised neural network, autoencoder, can be used to see structures of the input that you would not expect. So because it is completely unsupervised, has nothing to do with entanglement. It never knows about the property of entanglement, but still here it shows, so I think this is entangled, this is not entangled. It shows very clearly a clustering of entangled states. So that means you immediately, when you see this, you know that there is the property of entanglement should be very easily seen only from the experiment itself. So a big picture takeaway is that by looking into the internal states of the neural network, you can see surprising things.
Have you tried to map like some synthetic experiments to the graphs that you were sharing before?
So this is here the inputs were basically with this hardcore discrete experimental setups, not with the graphs. So no, we didn't do that.
Okay, but it could it work?
You can do this for all type of data. One thing is that here we are restricted into 2D because I can print a 2D. But now that we have 3D classes, we can have a third neuron in the information bottleneck. So I have no idea whether this helps, but yeah.
Thank you.
So I have a slightly cynical question, I'm sorry for that, but in this we knew exactly what pattern we were looking for, so we can look at multiple latent spaces and see what conforms with what we want to see. And this is something I've seen a lot in interpretability of neural networks and so on, where if you want to see a peacock, you will make a saliency map till you see a peacock, which is...
Yes, I absolutely agree. And this is what I mentioned before already, that if you want to know whether your method works, you need to apply it to new physics. Rediscovery it's completely unclear for me whether rediscovery says that the method works or not work, because you might have this human bias. In this case, I could argue that the property that we looked 4 is the most obvious property you would think about, and it was the first thing we looked at. So it's kind of here simple, but for more complex systems, yeah, I don't know at which properties I would look for them. Yeah, how I would choose the coloring. Yeah, completely agree.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me just mention one last thing here. So we are now working on more advanced quantum experiments or experiments in general, also in fundamental physics, and one of them is on new, more sensitive detectors for gravitational wave detectors. So we are working together with the LIGO collaboration, try to find more sensitive detectors. And one of the main ideas that we took from the experience from before is try to have a universal representation of your space. In a similar way, again, as a neural network is a universal function approximator. Before we had this universal quantum experiment approximator, and now here we have basically introduced something like a universal interferometer, universal quantum interferometer approximator. And in all of those cases, the only thing that your discovery tool needs to do then is take this general thing and extract in some way the solution out of it. So instead of building up the solution itself, which is this enormously large combinatorial space, we have now this continuous space again. And from there, we can extract the solutions. And we already see that this is the thing that worked very well for us compared to other methods. Okay, so I would go to the last part, if there are no questions. Yes?
Regarding the emerging clustering in the autoencoder, do you think it's more important to have that clustering, the semantics of the data, or the specific representation of the data that you choose? For example, if you have represented your data with a different kind of representations, would those clustering emerge regardless?
Yes, I think there would be a different emergent coloring, because here the coloring is very much dependent on this specific representation. What the specific coloring means to us is that there's a very simple relation between some property of the experiment and this entanglement property that we looked at. And that might not be true for other representations. Yeah.
So choosing the correct representation is as important as analyzing the latent space produced by a neural network.
Yeah, I think this is related to this other question, that it's very difficult to choose it's probably then very difficult to choose the properties that you want to see inside. So when I know what I want to look for instance, entanglement, and I have some guess, then it's easy. But for new question, or for instance, if I want to see the heliocentric worldview, I will see it probably. But for new questions, yeah, it's probably difficult to, or that is probably the challenge that you need to solve. What is the good representation and the good question that you're looking inside?
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so my last part, which will be short, is about using huge amount of scientific literature. And for that, we can go back to the original question, or to our goal. So our goal is to make a computer program that can inspire surprising and interesting ideas. Okay. So the question is, what does it mean that something is surprising and interesting? And that is obviously very subjective and depends on all of our previous knowledge. So the question is, how can we get this knowledge into the computer? And so this was a few years ago, so pre-GPT. I had no idea how one could do this. until I saw an extremely interesting paper that was done in a collaboration between biochemists and computational sociologists. And if you ever have time, go and look for the research of computational sociologists and science of science and meta-science researchers. It's absolutely amazing what they are doing. They are looking at science from a big picture, and yeah, it's really, really cool. So I found this paper, and in this paper, they represent basically knowledge as relation between scientific concepts. And then they draw conclusions. They look at how scientists have investigated the space of biochemistry. In concrete, in their case, the space of biochemistry molecules. So they have, I think, 30,000 unique biomolecules, and those biomolecules are the nodes of the network. And the nodes are connected when an abstract or a title mention those two molecules together. So basically when the paper investigates those two molecules. And what they have seen is that scientists are very conservative, and they basically always do the same thing, and it's very rare that they are making big jumps and look at different things. So they then applied some supercomputer computation, some heavy computation, and found new strategies how the entire scientific community could investigate this space much more efficiently. So that's very interesting. But the cool thing was that they had a way to represent the knowledge of millions of papers. And I wanted to do this also for quantum physics. So the first thing was, I need this concept list. So they have a concept list of biomolecules. I had to create this concept list kind of myself. So what I did was, I wrote a crawler for Wikipedia that takes all of the concepts from the class of quantum physics at Wikipedia, and I took a bunch of physics and optics book and combined them into a human-generated list. And second, I used all 100,000 articles that are in quantum physics or in optics at arXiv. And I wrote a crawler for that. I was blocked a few times, but then I understood how to download 100,000 articles. And then I used some natural language processing to extract concepts from these articles. And that produced a list of a few thousand, I think 6,000 concepts of quantum physics. So now I take those 6,000 concepts are now the vertices of my knowledge graph. And now, as the biochemist, I want to draw connections when two concepts are investigated together. And for that, I use the 100,000 articles from arXiv, and I use all papers that have ever been published by APS. And that was kind of cool. So I knew I need more data because arXiv is only until the 90s. And so I wrote an email to APS and asked them, hey, can you send me all papers that you have ever published in all of your journals? And surprisingly, one day later, I got an email and it said, yes, sure, and they shared the link with me. And I can just download all of them. So that was amazing. Yeah. So now I had 750,000 papers and can now build up this co-occurrence knowledge graph of quantum physics. And maybe here a small example. So here we have a paper that studies interaction-free measurement with single photons. So that paper is from 1995. So interaction-free measurement, single photon gets the edge from 1995. We have a different paper, Michelson interferometer and single photon. So that should be here, 1995, and another link between Leggett-Clark inequality, interaction-free measurement should be here, yes, 2015. And this is what I do for all of those 750,000 papers. So this is my knowledge graph. It's beautiful, isn't it? Anyway, so you can zoom in and you can see that this way of creating a graph clusters together semantically similar concepts. For instance, here we have contextuality, fast and speed of light, non-locality. So that is all about quantum entanglement in some way. I think there is some other cluster. Yeah, here there is PV84, quantum key distribution, decoy state. That is all about quantum communication here in this cluster. So you see, but the sanity check, you see that similar properties, similar concepts are clustered closely together. So yeah, it's a good sanity check. One can then look which concepts grew very fast, so very important topics or hyped topics. It's very interesting. Quantum machine learning was the fastest growing until 2018 or so. Yeah, there are many others that quantum physicists might know, boson sampling. The fastest growing concept is qubit, which is kind of cool because it is the combination of bit information theory and quantum physics. And when it appeared, it just skyrocketed. You can do the same for fast-growing connections. But now, so now we have we know how humans investigated the field of quantum physics in the last 100 years. But now, because we are machine learning researchers and we have a lot of data from the past, we can try to predict what human scientists will do in the future, because, of course, we have the data from the past. So now the question could be, which unconnected pair of concepts, that means those that are not connected in the network, that have never been investigated jointly, will be investigated in the next 5 years. And that is a typical machine learning or neural network task. So, is there a question?
So before, with the was it biochemistry research, you showed different lines, which were like the lines of research, and you showed also an optimal line of research. And if you could please elaborate a little bit on that, how can you establish which line of research is optimal? How to investigate this network is the optimal way to do it?
Yeah, there you need a lot of assumption, and it's questionable whether they are very reasonable. So I think they say that if one link is established, then there's a connection between those two, and then you don't need to investigate this link anymore. And then the question is how to strategically investigate everything. You cannot just go to a completely random place. You should investigate things that are within what you already investigated, but nothing twice. So of course that doesn't mean that you should really only have one paper per concept pair, because but it's a first approximation of this idea.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Just want to ask that when you say that they are clustered together, it means that one of the links that the two nodes has, then it's become bigger and bigger and bigger because, I don't know, it's mentioned in 10 paper, 100 paper, and then they cluster together?
Yeah, so good question. I didn't mention it. How I draw this network is, okay, with a network tool that's called GEFI, but the underlying idea is that all concepts, you replace it with a mechanical model. All concepts are basically positively charged magnets, so they repel each other, and every vertex is, every connection is something like a spring, so you attract them. And then the more papers you have between two concepts, the stronger the string is. And also in the neighborhood, if you have a lot of strings in the neighborhood, you also attract them. And this is how you get on these clusters.
Thank you.
Right. So this is now machine learning. This is now a machine learning task. This network, unfortunately, is very large, at least for me. It has 6,000 vertices. And for my laptop, this is too large to use it as a complete input into a neural network. Because to describe it, you need 6,000 and 6,000 matrix, which is very, very discrete. And that was too much for me. So instead, what I've done is you can take two vertex pairs that are never investigated together, and you compute a lot of their properties, so basically features. For instance, how many papers contain this one? How many papers contain this one? How many shared neighbors do they have? And so on. There are a lot of network theoretical properties, for instance, network distances and so on. And now instead of putting the whole network in and predicting a whole network, you can put in one concept pair at a time, one unconnected concept pair at a time with its features, and let it predict whether this unconnected concept pair will be connected a few years later. And so you can train this now, for instance, from the year 2012 to predict 2017, and of course 2017 we have the data, so we can give perfectly the feedback, the supervision signal, and you can predict this. And after you have predicted this, okay, let's skip this. Oh, I didn't mention it. Okay, anyway, after you have predicted this, you could now apply it with the year 2017 to the year 2022 or 2023. So you can now go 5 years into the future and see whether the predictions are still good. And we have seen that the area under the curve, which is a measure for quantifying the quality of a classification, is 0.85. Who has heard about the area under the curve before? Ah, perfect. Yeah, it's good to be on Friday here at the machine learning conference. I'm sure this, yeah, okay. I don't need to explain this. So the area under the curve, you can think about it intuitively as the percentage that if you take a random true and a random false example, what is the percentage that the random true example is ranked higher than the random false example? So in our case, with 85%, we can predict whether one that will be investigated together is actually ranked higher. Mm-hmm.
A question, how did you define test set here?
We had two test sets, or basically we had one test set in the same year from 2012 to 2017. We choose, I don't know, let's say 100,000 unconnected vertex pairs in the test set that we don't look at, and 1 million in the training set. So we check all the time in the same year whether the test quality, test loss goes down, and then we use a second test set, which we call the evaluation set, which is then actually the prediction for the future, for the neural network that, for the knowledge graph that the neural network has never seen before.
But the nodes in the test set, they were the nodes, the concepts, they were not seen during training, because if you just different papers which connected the same concepts, you are. So if your data points are basically papers, right? Like which connect concepts. And if you have like two data points, which are different independent data points, which could land in test and train into different, but they are actually talking about the same concepts. It's
no. What we want to predict is not necessarily one paper. Could be many papers. So it's an edge, and the edge could be made up of one paper or of many papers. So the case what you say, it would be either in the test set or in the training set. Okay. is that question? No. This worked quite well for my little quantum physics example. And because we kind of want to use it later for suggesting new ideas, I wanted to find out what is really the best algorithm to do this link prediction task. And this link prediction task in quantum physics is already difficult because the number of papers grow exponential. But in the field of machine learning or artificial intelligence, it is much, much more difficult because the semantic network or the number of papers grow exponential in that field. So this is the actual number of papers per year, number per paper per month for different years. And you see that it grows exponential with a doubling rate of every 2.4 years, which is kind of crazy. So I don't know how human researchers can work there when your field explodes, basically. But yeah, so we wanted to use this. We want to use this suggestion or predictions later. So I wanted to know really what is the best algorithm to make this link prediction task. And we initialized the competition, AI competition, where we used exactly papers from the field of AI to predict what will happen in the future of AI, basically. So we, I call the paper "Predicting the Future of AI with AI." So one of the so we wanted to know how the field of AI evolves itself. And the competition was basically the same. You get a knowledge graph until, let's say, 2018, and you should predict what happens until 2022. And there were a lot of competitors, so we had 25,000 euro prize money, and we had a lot of competitors, and many of the competitors outperformed the simple algorithm that I explained before, and they used very cool methods like graph neural networks to represent the data, transformers or auto-generated feature extraction, and so on. One very big surprise was, here some data, this is again the area under the curve. One very big surprise for me was that a method that used a pure statistical approach, no machine learning, just fitting of one parameter, outperformed my neural network-based approach and many of the other competitors. So already, if you know what you're doing in statistics, you can get really, really good results, even for such complex tasks. Yeah, and then the last thing I mentioned, I want to use these predictions in some way. I want to use them for suggesting new research ideas for scientists. And for that, now, very recently, this is not published yet, so please don't tell anybody, you also not internet. We use now.
Sorry, can I ask a question before you go on? I was just wondering, so you were talking, you do prediction of the edges. How often are the most groundbreaking ideas associated with new edge rather than a new node that hasn't been invented before?
Yes, that's a very good question. So many things are, for many things you need to come up with new concepts. I showed you this computational science paper right before. So computational sociology. So because they are sociologists, they looked at such things. What they have seen, they didn't compare new edges versus new nodes, but they compared new edges that are in the neighborhood versus new edges that are far away. And they saw that, I think they downloaded 150 different prizes in physics, and they saw that far away links are more are more likely to lead to high prizes in physics than close connected links. So you see that the further you go away, that means kind of the more creative or far away your work is, the higher your chance for prizes. Of course, there's survivor bias, but yeah. And I would guess that though that a similar community has also investigated what you mentioned. Okay, so the last thing. Recently we used now 3 million papers from arXiv, ChemArXiv, medRxiv, and we extract 300,000 scientific concepts. We do this now a little bit more systematic. And we build up, again, a knowledge graph. And what we want to do now is taking two scientists and look at the subgraph of those scientists. So, for instance, scientist 1 investigates this and that concept, scientist 2 investigates this concept, and the question is, can you find new collaboration suggestions for these scientists? For instance, I would love it if I have a friend who works in astrodynamics or something, and I have no idea about that field, but someone suggests to me what I could potentially work on with this person. So that is the goal here. So now we look at all of the unconnected vertices. That means I want to I want to work on topics that haven't been done yet, obviously. And we can rank those unconnected vertex pairs as before with neural networks. And that's the last step. What we're doing is we take those ideas from our semantic networks and we produce a very specific prompt, and we create this prompt, we put this prompt into GPT-4. And we ask GPT-4 to create a research question for this idea, for these two scientists. And this is one of the examples. There are two scientists. One of them works on electron microscopy. The other one, who was that? Probably on deep learning. And those two things have never been investigated together. And the program suggests then a research collaboration between those two. This is the other idea that is suggested, HyperVis. This is between a researcher that uses 3D environment and one machine learning researcher that does hypothesis generation, or among others, and it suggested the research objective, the questions and the contributions of the individual researchers. Now, why this would make sense is because scientific literature is so crazy large you cannot know everything, especially when you want to collaborate with someone outside of your field. So that might be a cool tool. And I think why it is useful to have not only GPT, but this knowledge base, this hardcore knowledge base, is for two reasons. So first, GPT is very bad in producing novel things. And it is also not so good in producing correct things. But here, the novelty comes from the semantic network. So when we suggest a topic, we know that this topic must be new because it has never been worked on in the scientific literature. And the correctness in this case isn't so important because those are suggestions, inspirations. If you take them up, yes or no, it doesn't matter. But it's just a way to kind of put you into a different mindset, that you think about different ideas that you potentially would not have thought about yourself. So at the moment we are in the case that we prepare actually a study with humans, and let's see what happens. Okay, and with that, we talked about computer-designed experiments where we can learn. We could potentially suggest actually new research ideas with very different techniques and get inspirations from those. And in the end, I'm curious about a few things. A main question that I'm thinking about, and I'm very curious what you're thinking, is what distinguishes a human researcher fundamentally from a potentially future artificial scientist? So some answers would be a human is creative, but if you have seen those pictures from Dali recently, or also stories from GPT and so on, sound quite creative. So I'm not sure whether I would say that anymore. What about curiosity? Human is curious, a machine is just doing its thing. But there's this very big field of curiosity-based exploration, which I have briefly mentioned before with the Super Mario that explores its world. So we can kind of approximate the notion of curiosity. So we can also build curious agents. What about understanding? Well, that depends a little bit what understanding, what you actually mean. And I think as soon as you are able to write it down, you can write a code that can satisfy your definitions. So I'm very curious about what you're thinking about this and about a number of other questions. For instance, how do we choose research questions? Why are we doing anything at all and not just lie in bed all the time? And so on. So with this, I would like to end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, clearly this is the time for Q&A. So please hands up if you have any questions.
Or answers.
Or answers, yeah. Apologies.
Hello.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, in this case, what's your view on the novelty of some research? Can we say something like if some research is predictable from some model, it might be lack of novelty, or a novel research is something you cannot be predict from such model?
Yeah, probably also depends what you mean by novel. I think there are a lot of research that are groundbreaking but predictable. I'm thinking gravitational wave detections. People thought gravitational wave might exist, otherwise we have to overthrow general relativity. It was one of the biggest breakthrough in physics. Very good question, I have no answer. Sorry. If you have some thoughts, let me know.
Can I? Mm-hmm. This is more curiosity than a question, but you mentioned that there's some sort of quantifiable way to assert how close your research or how novel it is, with depending if it is close to some nodes in this knowledge graph. I was wondering if you actually can build some sort of causal graph, or what concepts actually lead to the novelty, to the big impact in novelty, like from this phrase of Newton, I believe, that says, "I am standing in the shoulders of giants." I mean, can we actually identify the giants that he was standing on by looking at his work?
What I mentioned before is that you can, from this network, see that links that are further away, which you could call more creative, lead more proportionally to prices. But that was a co-occurrence network, which was very, very basic information. What you say is much more complex, so you need a much more complex representation of your data. I'm not sure whether you can really do it then as this hardcore network when you have this causal graph. At least it will be much larger. I'm not aware of this research, but I'm not really much aware of this type of literature-based discovery. I would guess that people are trying to look into this, and they have some notions of novelty. So this I know, but how good they work, I'm not sure.
Have you been working with someone?
Where?
Here. Yeah. Have you been working with someone that was recommended to you by your network and ChatGPT, for example?
Say again?
Like you showed us.
Yes, the suggestions.
Have you reached out to somebody
that
was recommended to you?
So this is in beta phase. So how I'm doing the tests recently is when I go to a conference and I know a few people in the audience, I prepare this beforehand for the audience and then show it randomly during my talk and surprise them. And then I get feedback, and we improved the tool. So in the beginning, it was quite bad. We got a lot of feedback and know how to improve it much more. And recently, it got much better. We got comments from external people that they found either that some of the ideas are exactly what they are working on right now, or that they would like to work on, and also one of my own collaboration or potential collaboration came exactly because of discussion about these ideas. So yeah, we don't have clear-cut way yet, but I hope soon we have that, because we are doing now, we hope to start doing those real experiments now, where we have people giving examples and they have to choose without knowing, and we analyze that. I need to look into how to do those experiments, but hopefully soon we know this much better.
I wanted to ask, are you planning any online demo of this system?
Yeah, I don't know yet how to show it in the best way, because it needs a connection to GPT, and because the computation in our semantic network usually takes half a day or so, because it's huge amount of data. We cannot really do it live, which is a pity at the moment, but yeah, maybe we have some ideas. I mean, if we coincide in some conference, let me know a few days before, then I can do it for you.
Thank you. I think I would find that very useful.
Cool.
So I have just a question about the fact of being able to predict what future trend will generate new papers. And so my idea is that if we can predict the future in what paper will come out, will this change the future itself? And is this positive or negative in the decision of what actual studies will be published and researched?
Yeah, that's a very, very important question, and I'm thinking about this myself also quite some time. You're basically talking about self-fulfilling prophecies. So let's say I can show that this tool works, and I publish it without any safety features, and everyone takes serious what the tool says, and the tool says always the same thing. That would probably be a very, very bad outcome. If research is then more focusing down than what is actually the idea to give new ideas. So there we need to think a bit how to do this. If it is done in this personalized way, I'm less scared, because it will give different suggestions for different people or different pairs of people even. So there I would be less worried. But if you just do it, a hypothetical scientist that knows everything, what should that scientist work on? Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any final questions or answers?
Yeah, one very final thought, that you asked what would be the difference between an artificial scientist and a real scientist. I would say that mainly it would be consciousness, I think, until we don't know how to model that as well. But I think it will still take some time.
Do you need consciousness for science? No. I don't know. But that's a good point, yeah. I wonder what's the practical implication of that.
I want to try and comment as well on this difference between artificial and human scientists as well. So I find that if we consider just a single human, then it might not be so straightforward to say what's the difference between a human scientist and artificial one. But what if we consider the whole humanity? So after all, this model is trained over something we are providing it, the language we created it, while we don't know, we don't have any such model that is trading its own meaning or stuff like that.
So what are you saying? That when you look at the whole collective of scientists,
what I'm saying is that like, if we consider ChatGPT, okay, it shows very remarkable, almost human-like capacity in many tasks, but it's still trained to follow a distribution which we created, while we as humanity didn't have any such distribution to follow.
Yes. Yes. That's a good point. So we are a lot of different agents that have different goals that would answer many of those questions slightly different and so on. So that leads to a very efficient exploration of everything, and the best, those with the best strategies, they contribute something. So maybe that means we cannot have one artificial scientist, but we need a huge collective with slightly different parameters. And didn't in one of those very complex games that DeepMind solved, they also didn't create one agent, but they created a bunch of agents that played against each other. What game was that? It was one of those fancy fighting games.
StarCraft?
Probably StarCraft, yeah. They did something similar already there, so that's a good indication, yeah. Good.
Thanks.
Good way to think about this.
So could you go back to the plot where you compared where you had the rock arc curves?
Here?
No, like one earlier, like where you actually showed, yeah, exactly that one. No, yes, that one. So So these are just like the non-linear lines are like your model, right?
Second, this is what?
Here.
This is what?
So like all the non-straight lines are like models you trained, and you excluded data to make predictions about the future, right?
So here we go from 2012 to 2017. So it has the data until 2012 and can predict. Yeah. Here we have less data. Here we have less data, and red is just indication of what the random predictor would give. So yes, less data.
And you're trying to predict whether there will in the future be an edge between two topics.
Yes.
And did you try any other baselines? Because for me, many of the edges would be simple to predict. For example, in the future, pick any science topic and machine learning, and there's probably going to be a whole bunch of papers on that. So it's not really clear whether you're just predicting broad trends, which are kind of obvious, or actually very specific things that are highly non-trivial.
Yes. So we are working right now, and I hope the paper is online in 3 weeks. We use a different thing to predict, not whether it will be connected, but whether it will be high impact. The quality is significantly less, as you can imagine, because it's much more difficult to predict this just from a knowledge graph, but it's also significantly better than random. So you can significantly better than random predict whether a new topic combination will be of high impact, with some notion of high impact, which might be not the best notions, like average citations or something like that. But yeah, but we play with this right now.
Okay, thank you.
I would try what's this discriminative property between the human scientist and the artificial scientist. An artificial scientist would be the solutions generator, and the human scientist would be the question generator.
Okay, then give me a second. What am I doing here?
I thought of it, but you're still defining. So this is my question. Find me the link, and it looks for you for an answer. You define the question. And do you know of an algorithm which defines the questions or so?
So, okay, yes, I agree. I have an objective, but the objective is independent of, or is not directly related to the research question that is investigated then. For instance, I could ask the question, what will be a high impact new research topic, which is very different from the actual project. So in a way, you abstract it slightly away, but of course, I'm still asking that specific question. In the end, what you are saying, I think this is very much related to how we choose research question or what do we do. Yeah.
And the thing is, like, also related to the question, and it's personal, like, hypothesis. It's the point of view or the personal, like, the personality of the scientist. What is so much different because this how to say it, narrowness, so to say, one-sidedness makes maybe out the question.
Yes, and this is probably related to the thoughts here that you cannot have that maybe one artificial scientist is not enough. You need a whole fleet of different ones with maybe different knowledge even, but different preferences. I'm not sure. It sounds reasonable.
I would rephrase the third question, actually, especially the second part, when we have like too much data, right? Especially like even within machine learning, so it's like subfield of something even. We can see that many areas are not talking with each other, so that would be really interesting tool actually to like submit, I don't know, a bunch of papers, and then by looking at only at the tables, you can infer some information that maybe scientists couldn't notice that there's like phenomenon that is happening and it's like link between the paper.
I think this is quite related to what the field of literature-based discovery tries to do, and that probably works especially well for machine learning, where there's a lot of new data coming out all the time, actually, exponentially fast. A different question is, what do you do if you have no new data? Like in physics, we basically have, we have new measurements, but we have no new data. Nearly all of the data, basically all of the measurement data confirm something that we already know. It nearly never happens that something new happens. So what are you doing then if all that you measure is basically what you already know? There are sometimes that something new comes up, also not 100% new. For instance, gravitational waves, Higgs particles were predicted long time ago. Neutrino oscillation was the only thing that I'm aware of that was new measurement data, and that was what, 20, 30 years ago? So now the question is, what did physicists do in this time? Yes.
But like in physics, how often does it happen that actually somebody came up with idea?
Second?
Yeah, so even in physics, I mean, I maybe it's lack of my expertise knowledge, but like I cannot imagine a situation when somebody come up with a problem and the bottleneck is no data at all. In that sense, like...
But that is what happens in physics.
Okay, I thought it's more like... okay.
There's no new data. So the biggest problems are maybe quantum gravity, or what happens with the information at the black hole. Do you know how many experiments there are with information close to black holes? Not so many. Because we cannot do those experiments. So those are basically thought experiments that you have to work with. And the question is, how can you come up with thought experiments? What does that even mean? How could you try to make sense out of the information problem close to black holes? Yeah. And I don't really know the answer how one can do that.
All right. Could I ask you to thank Mario once again with a round of applause?
Thank you very much. And I will be here until Sunday, so whenever you want to chat, answer some of those questions, whatever, I'm very happy to talk.
Yeah, so I do just a couple of announcements. Well, first of all, you will have a chance to answer some of those questions to Mario over during the party. That's just about to start, I think, in a couple of minutes.